What's going on YouTube? Carmine here, bringing you another manga review. This time, it's Vinland Saga. This was recommended to me by several of you who are subscribed to me, and I need something to read after catching up with Terraformers. This manga is a bit more grounded. It falls in the range of historical fiction and action. Some of you told me it's a lot like Berserk, but set in our world and not on steroids, which makes sense after reading a couple of the chapters. The story of Vinland Saga follows a boy named Thorfinn on his own quest for revenge against Askjald. By the way, I'm using Google Translate to figure out how to say some of these names, so if I butcher any of it, I do apologize. Years prior to the opening story, Askjald was hired to kill Thorfinn's father, who's an incredibly strong Viking general. Thorfinn, witnessing the death of his father by Askjald's group, vows vengeance in his own way. Thorfinn initially joins up with his father's killer as a means to get close enough to murder him in a fair duel. So instead of slicing his throat while he sleeps, Thorfinn instead hones a skill over time in order to do so. In order to earn the right to engage in these duels with Askjald, Thorfinn usually goes and has to complete these difficult tasks for the group when they're on the job, which usually involves taking the enemy's head or getting behind enemy lines and fucking their shit up. Now, what I liked about this manga is that while Thorfinn is the main character, the story doesn't entirely revolve around him. He's just a small piece of a larger world, and events in the story could move without him, meaning he isn't that important to events happening in the background. In some other mangas, events around the world are triggered by the main characters or his group, and in turn, responses are made to those developments, and this manga is not like that at all. Understand what I mean? While he does help historical figures and has encounters with them, if he were to die, then you can assume things would go on normally as though he never existed, which is why I love when it comes to this historical fantasy type of story. Thorfinn is not special, he is just a boy that has gone through shit. This is what the original Assassin's Creed game did, put us through the viewpoint of fictional characters who don't really affect how history was told, but just as a witness who gets swept up in the tide of political maneuvers and how fucked up the world back then was. Some readers may be off-put by the flashbacks, but personally I enjoyed them. I felt it helped flesh out the main character a little more and the world he comes from and grows up in. What I will say is that because this is an era where strength was valued and brutality was everywhere, you may not find many strong female characters. Back then, females usually stayed in the home with the children and were often sold into slavery when their village was taken over by barbarians or Vikings or whatever. So if you're going to cry foul because of the lack of strong female characters, or any female characters in here for that matter, then you are better off without this. The artwork is pretty good, and I do like how much research went into the whole thing. One thing I did notice is that Vinland Saga's characters can make goofy anime faces at times, but in a moment's notice it can get bloody and violent, and very real. The artist and writer doesn't shy away from a boob being shown here and there, or heads being cracked, but he isn't exactly trying to fit it in every 5 pages, you know what I'm saying? There is also some politics in here and religion, but nothing major like in Game of Thrones or anything. It all seems simple enough for anybody to understand, and it just fits in the timeline. Now, I do recommend this manga for people who love action and ancient historic stories about wars, battles, Vikings, or just action in general. If you're someone who enjoys Rurouni Kenshin or anything like that, this may be for you. If you're someone who's like really into science fiction, then you may not like it as much. I've gotten up to 100 chapters, and in order for me to give this a fair review, I have to split this manga into 2 separate pieces in one video. The first 50 chapters are completely different from the next 50. The first 50, I would give a solid 5 out of 5. Perfect, I could not put it down as soon as I got to reading it. Thorfinn is a person you can understand, and in time, he does grow, but the supporting characters of Askjald and his second-in-command Bjorn is where a lot of the personality comes from. Character development of Thorfinn doesn't really start to shine until after 50 chapters, mainly because, as I said, while he is the main character, the story doesn't really develop until the supporting characters, based on history, start doing their own thing. The action was perfect, the characters had their own unique personalities, what motivated them, why they do what they do, and everything about the world felt solid and believable. It was also very realistic for the actions of some of the characters to have consequences instead of being brushed off as a silly thing like in some other stories. The first 50 chapters, 5 out of 5. The next 50, however, without spoiling too much of it, I'd give 3.8 out of 5. Now the reason is Thorfinn spends most of his time in England during the first 50, but the next part, which I would call part 2, has a time skip, introduces new characters, and a brand new situation for a lot of them. Thorfinn goes through an interesting character development, a major one, but it isn't what I wanted, to be honest, and it seems impossible considering the violent time period, but I guess that's the point. He goes from being a badass warrior to a complete bitch, a pacifist. And I'm not talking shit to pacifists, but I won't go on from there. But it just seems like the guy who initially wrote this quit, and some other asshole jumped in and wrote part 2. It's so different from the first 50. You get into it because it's like action and violent, and there's so much of this going on. And then part 2 is just so not the thing I got into. I thought when he goes to the farm, the story moves so slow and it dragged so much, and I get the point of it is for his development to be, for him to actually end up like how his father was, but it really doesn't make any sense unless they're like moving him into like a pacifist who fights when the time is right, or a pacifist who fights not to kill but to break bones. I mean, it's just such a different story, and it's such a different change that it almost feels not even worth keeping up with. I'll be honest, the only reason I'm keeping up with it is because I've invested so much time into reading it. I might as well keep up with the next chapter, but I won't be racing to catch the next one as soon as it's released. I think they went into a terrible direction with the second half of this series. Like I said, I understand why he makes these decisions, and it seems reasonable, but it's such a drastic change from the original tone and the original concept, it really couldn't, I just really couldn't get behind it that much. I'm not saying it's bad, but what I am saying that what I'm saying is too much of nothing happens more often than not, and it wasn't the thing I was expecting. Part 2 does bring interesting new characters, situation, and developments, but not enough for me to really enjoy it as I did part 1. Vinland Saga, I give the first part 5 out of 5, and the second 3.8 out of 5 for its, second half. If you really want to check it out, you can buy it on Amazon, or you can read it online from Crunchyroll. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching.